Hi, I'm Brittany, a neurodivergent mum and speech pathologist. This is Not Just Theories, where I share what actually works in my real, messy life. Because life doesn't follow a theory. Here's what I actually do. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Not Just Theories. Today, I am starting a new little mini-series. Might actually be quite a long mini-series because it is going to be all about infant and child sleep, which is a massive topic. I am not a trained child or infant sleep specialist, so I want to make that really clear. I'm coming at this from the lens of a parent who had one child, my first child, who we joked was allergic to sleep. You know, we're talking slept in 20 to 30 minute increments all night for the first 3 months. We never experienced a 4-month sleep regression because she never progressed past that. We sort of got to 45-minute increments by the time she was 3 or 4 months old. Occasionally, when we were really lucky, in her first 6 months, we might get 1-2 hour stretch overnight without needing support to go back to sleep. So the first 6 months, we had occasionally some 2-hour stretches, but other than that, we were woken every 30 to 60 minutes all night, every night. We went to mostly 1 to 2 hourly wakes from about 6 months to about 18 months with a real dip in sleep at 18 months. So at that point, I remember I counted one night, I had to go to work the next day, and I counted 17 wake-ups overnight. So when I talk about parent of a child who was allergic to sleep, I mean it. I'm not talking about my child waking 4 or 5 times a night. That was where we got to at the end that we were really, really happy about. 4 to 5 wakes was quite achievable and manageable for us. So some of this will not be relevant to many families because I'm well aware that my child was at one end of the extreme levels of sleep challenges. But because of that, more than anyone I know of any other child, I have spent so long reading about infant sleep, and we have tried basically everything. So these series of episodes are going to be some of the things that cumulatively helped us move from nights of 12 to 20 wake-ups down to nights of 4 to 5 wakes by the time our daughter was 2. And then closer to the time that she was 3, we really got down to 1 or 2 wakes a night. And that's where we're still sitting now that she's nearly 4. These strategies that I'm suggesting are primarily quite evidence-based, and none of them are a magic bullet. Not a single one of them was a magic bullet for us. They might be for your family if your child's sleep needs aren't quite so complicated. But I guess that's the other thing, is that sleep is so complicated. The number of things we tried that didn't work in isolation but cumulatively made a difference was a lot. So I'll be sharing all of that over the next few episodes. And I just, wanted to start with where I'm coming from. It is not from the lens of a trained professional. It is, the mum that has just spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours reading like any content that was even vaguely relevant to infant sleep. We have seen a whole bunch of different specialists in our time working through some of this stuff. And just sort of using this platform to share what helped us. Anyway, that was a little bit of an introduction, but I want to make it quite clear that the end point of this series is not necessarily a child that sleeps through the night or a rigid schedule or, doing enough things right. I'm going to be really exploring things that might be contributing to why sleep might be hard for your kid or for you. And then some of those really specific things that very slowly and very imperfectly helped us get sleep to the point where we were all getting enough rest. Because for us, that was the end goal. We couldn't look at sleeping through the night as the end goal because it was so far away. Everything that we did along the way was, how can we make sleep feel more manageable? How can we try and prioritize everyone, including our child, getting the rest that they need to function? So today, I'm going to be starting with one of the more powerful changes that we made for both of my children. This is something that helped them both because my second was a better sleeper than my first. He only woke every hour from 4 months to 14 months. We experienced the 4-month sleep regression with him because he'd actually progressed to sleeping some 4 to 5 hour increments before that. So, it was a very, very fundamentally different experience having a few months of reasonable sleep from that sort of 2 to 4 month age. Made a huge difference for things like postpartum recovery and rest and all of that. So even though we went back to hourly wakes for nearly a year, it was fundamentally a different experience of infant sleep. And part of that is because we already had some of these things implemented from our first child. So the first thing that I want to talk about was one of the hardest to implement, and that is a consistent wake-up time. It doesn't sound like it should be as hard as it is, but I'll get there. So I chose to start this little sleep series here quite intentionally because I think a lot of parents focus, really understandably, focusing on bedtime, like an earlier bedtime or a later bedtime or a longer routine or a shorter routine or more baths or fewer books or more white noise or less stimulation. Heaps and heaps of things go into bedtime. And bedtime does matter, but what we actually learned through something called the Possums Sleep Program framework is that bedtime is actually downstream of something that's a lot more fundamental, which is your child's circadian rhythm. That's their internal body clock. And the strongest cue for that clock is not bedtime. It is not what happens at bedtime. It is wake-up time paired with light exposure. So I remember the moment that I came across and understood this idea because I was exhausted. I was emotionally really raw, very depleted, in the depths of postpartum depression and anxiety, and hadn't slept at this point, I think, for probably 8 or 9 months. I hadn't had more than a 1.5 hour consolidated sleep period. So I hadn't even been able to link 2 sleep cycles at that point. And that's on top of pregnancy. And, anyone who's been pregnant can tell you that sleep is not amazing during pregnancy. But at this point, 9 months after major surgery to give birth to my child, I had not slept for longer than an hour and a half at a time. And then I learned that waking at roughly the same time each day anchors the body clock. And letting sleep drift later in the morning can worsen night sleep. And I was really upset and I was really angry and sad and honestly a bit betrayed, because when you're so severely sleep deprived, the idea of waking your baby up, of getting up earlier than your baby might have let you stay in bed, was cruel. Because every instinct in your body says, like, they're finally sleeping, don't touch it. You've got the chance for another 25 minutes of sleep now. Don't wake them up. Rest instead. And it just, over time, we decided to actually give it a go. And we saw, letting them catch up on sleep in the morning was actually making everything harder. Because when you let that morning time, wake up time drift later and later, a few things happened. So that pushed naps later in the day. Naps stretched longer if they were then happening later in the day. Overall sleep pressure at each of those sleep times reduced. So the sleep pressure for that first nap was so low, and then it was pushing out later. And then because that was later, then the sleep pressure for the next time was later. And then the sleep pressure at bedtime by the end of the day was pretty low. And that makes it more likely that your child will resist going to sleep at night. And overall, night wakes increase because that lack of sleep pressure is this thing that builds slowly during the day and then helps your child stay asleep overnight, helps them link those sleep cycles together. And if sleep pressure is too low, your child will wake regularly. And if your child wakes regularly, they will not get enough sleep overnight. They will want to sleep in the morning to make up for the sleep they didn't take overnight. And then the whole cycle continues again and gets worse and worse and worse. So we were getting to the point, our regular bedtime for our child was getting closer and closer to midnight. Our wake up time was getting closer and closer to 9:30 a.m. And it was just this awful cycle. And I still wasn't back at work, so it was sort of working, but it wasn't we weren't getting the right amount of sleep. It's not like she was going to bed at midnight and sleeping straight through till 9:30. She was going to bed at midnight and then waking up 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 times before 9:30 a.m. So it just wasn't working. So obviously, if you going to bed late and waking up late is working for you, this is a completely different story if you're getting enough sleep. But for us, it wasn't working. So this idea of like a consistent wake up time doesn't apply just to babies. It actually applies to adults too. I think a lot of adults have experienced this. If you sleep in on the weekend and then you try and wake up at your regular work time on a Monday morning, you feel completely awful. And it's not just because it's not the weekend, it's because you're actually tired and you want to stay in bed. So even if you don't have kids, being finally allowed to sleep in can actually cause issues later in the week because it disrupts your circadian rhythm. When you sleep in significantly later on a Saturday or a Sunday, your body clock starts to shift really rapidly. It's good in some respects. It helps us get over jet lag sooner, but your body clock can shift really quickly. And then waking that early on the Monday morning is brutal, even if you technically had more sleep over the weekend than you normally would. So when I talk about this consistent wake time for babies and children, it is a biological principle. It's not a parenting technique. It's not something just for infants and children. It's actually like an evidence-based sleep science approach to having better circadian rhythm and better sleep quality. You listen to any actual sleep scientists talk about how adults can help their sleep. A consistent wake time is one of the first things they will suggest. But consistent does not mean early. So it's really important to remember that consistent wake time does not have to be early. It does not have to be 6 a.m. It does not have to be 7 a.m. Consistency at 8 a.m. works too. The body clock doesn't care what the time is. It cares that the timing is predictable. And I'll talk a little bit more about early morning light exposure separately. But it is really important to know that every choice has a trade-off. So a later wake time usually does mean later naps, which means a later bedtime and later night sleep, which is not a problem if it is working for your family. I'll be talking a lot more about that specific trade-off next episode when I will dive into sleep needs and total sleep in 24 hours. Today, I'm just going to be focusing in on that wake-up time. So it's not like we heard this and then implemented a strict schedule. We tried strict schedules. They didn't work for our kid. And I can talk more about that next week. It's because she didn't have consistent sleep needs every day. So strict schedules never really worked for us. But we chose a consistent wake up window, which is about a 30-minute window, and then aimed for that most days. Some days we nailed it and some days we didn't. Some mornings were really rough and some mornings felt really unfair. But over a couple of weeks, again, any change you make to infant sleep, you usually have to be pretty consistent for at least 2 weeks to see it change, especially if you're working with these circadian rhythm changes. 2 weeks, commit to it for 2 weeks and then see what happens. And we sort of noticed that naps started to get a little bit more predictable. Because we had that predictable wake up time, sleep pressure started to increase at similar times each day. So instead of naps sometimes being at 11 a.m. and sometimes being at 1 p.m., they more naturally started to happen, for example, between 11 and 11:30, they'd go to sleep. So again, it didn't mean a consistent nap time, but it made it fall within a shorter window than what it had before. We noticed a little bit less fighting at bedtime because sleep pressure had a bit more chance to build up, and we started getting slightly longer stretches overnight. So that's when we started getting closer to those 2-hour stretches at least once or twice a night. So again, like I said, not a magic bullet, but it did make a difference and it was absolutely a part of the picture for our child. So not magical, not immediate, but it improved enough to let us know that we were onto something. But wake up time alone is not the whole picture. Light exposure was a part of it as well. So light exposure tells the brain this is daytime now. Morning light triggers a hormone cascade that suppresses melatonin and regulates your cortisol and builds that sleep pressure for later. We didn't do anything fancy, but this is something like opening the blinds or the curtains, trying to sit near a window, or even stepping outside briefly. Even when you're exhausted, just a couple of minutes outside before we had breakfast was part of the picture for us. So not talking about going out and having like an enormous park visit or anything like that, It didn't need to go for long, but just opening up the curtains so natural light came into the house. And we did this from reasonably early on because it was definitely part of the picture for us, was getting that night-day switch around that newborn babies have. So we used this strategy really early on when our child was a newborn to help try and switch the daytime and nighttime sleep. But we sort of stopped doing it for a few months in the middle because it was just too hard. I was just exhausted. Trying to get outside was really challenging, but we did make a point to start prioritizing it at least for a little bit while we were resetting that circadian rhythm and we were setting that consistent wake up time. Something else that's part of this whole picture was that we started capping naps as well. So in addition to waking our child up in the morning, I know they say never wake a sleeping baby, but that advice just did not help us in the slightest. We also had to start waking her up from her naps. And it can bring up a lot of feelings for parents because naps are your break during the day, and it's really hard to keep naps short. But it's a really important part of that Possums Sleep Program. So for the first long time of my child's life, I spent ages and ages in like a dark room in the middle of the day trying to resettle my child who wouldn't sleep for longer than 20 minutes to try and get longer naps, because I didn't think a 20-minute nap was enough for a 3-month-old or a 5-month-old or an 8-month-old. So especially as the number of naps dropped down, you would typically expect to see them get longer, but we weren't actually seeing that. So we were sort of down to 2 naps, and all of the other kids I knew seemed to be doing 2 naps that were each between like 1 and 1.5 hours. They were getting like 3 hours of day sleep a day. And then I had a kid who was taking 2 20-minute naps, maybe 30 minutes if I was really, really lucky that day, for like less than an hour of total day sleep. And I spent so long fighting that and trying to put her down for longer so she'd wake up from a 20-minute nap. And then I'd try and put her back to sleep again. I'd spend 20 minutes rocking her, and then she'd go back to sleep for another 20 minutes maximum to try and get a 40-minute nap. But what I didn't realize was that when she woke that first time and was reasonably happy, it actually would have been better for me to just keep going with the day, because then the next nap wouldn't have been quite so big of a fight, because then I was having to do the same thing. I was rocking her sometimes for 30 or 40 minutes, feeding her to sleep, trying all sorts of things to try and get her to take that second nap. And she would just fight it and fight it and fight it. And it was taking me several hours a day to put her to sleep for 2 naps. So for each 20 to 40-minute nap she was having, I was spending up to an hour trying to put her to sleep. So letting her wake up from that first nap and not trying to resettle her made the second nap slightly less of a fight. And maybe it would only take me 20, 30 minutes to put her to sleep. So, not a magic bullet, but it helped. So that was one really big shift, was treating daytime sleep as just something to get us through to the next sleep, rather than something that had to last a certain amount of time because of, a sleep schedule that you've seen on the internet. I'll talk more about that next week, but we're not talking about eliminating naps when your child needs them. It's about letting your child just get by with enough sleep to get them through to the next sleep, because overall, we want their sleep pressure to increase during the day, and we don't want to reduce their sleep pressure too much with a nap, because that's what naps do, is they reduce the sleep pressure that your child has built up. And if you do that too much during the day, there's not going to be enough left for nighttime. Obviously, there are some kids who, we'll talk about it next week, have super high sleep needs and sleep pressure is not an issue for them. But if you've got a really wakeful little one, trying to help build their sleep pressure through the day involves not letting them have those lovely long naps that give you a huge break in the middle of the day, or a couple of long naps. So it's, again, that Possums approach is really reinforcing naps do not need to be long. They don't need to be in a dark room. They can be on the go. And on the go naps really, really helped us keep them short and get me outside and have that nice, exposure to the sun and exercise and all that sort of thing. Because I'm really lucky. My kids have both been kids who would sleep in the pram or the carrier. It's the only thing about their sleep that I'd probably say I was lucky for, because I know some people, their kids won't sleep in anywhere other than a dark room. But it came at a huge cost, which is that they would only sleep for 20 minutes at a time in either of those situations. So don't be too jealous of me for having kids that sleep on the go, because we paid for it in so many other ways. But letting those naps be short and on the go, and just interrupted if they got interrupted, particularly for my second kid. You do just need to get out and about with your eldest, and you can't prioritize a long middle of the day nap when you've got older children who need to be outside and doing things. So that was a big change for us. So consistent wake up time, letting sleep pressure build during the day and not reducing sleep pressure too much by letting your child nap for too long. So for us, we didn't need to cap naps originally. It was just more like not resettling our children when they wanted to sleep. For my second kid, though, he would have napped all day if you let him. He would have had a 4-hour nap, and then he wouldn't have slept it all overnight. So for him, we had to be really, really strict about waking him up from his middle of the day nap at a certain point. We still are. He's 18 months now, and we still make sure he does not sleep for longer than about an hour and a half during the middle of the day, because nights go a bit pear-shaped if he does that. So yeah, I've talked about that one a little bit. Hopefully it's clear what really helped us. And I want to acknowledge that this is really hard, because when you are so sleep deprived, waking your child up at a consistent time in the morning, capping their naps, which is like your one chance to sit down and rest during the day, it's really, really hard. And for the few weeks before we started seeing any change, it was a slog to get through. Call on whatever support you can during that time and hope that you'll start feeling more rested if your child is sleeping better overnight, and that's the long-term game. But it's really hard to make changes like this when you have no resilience left because your child is not sleeping. So I fully acknowledge that this is really hard stuff, and especially because it is not a quick fix and it doesn't solve everything, but it was worth it for us. So, 2 extra data points. For both of our kids, the consistent wake time made a really big difference. Really big difference meaning, going from waking every 45 minutes to waking maybe every 2 hours for at least a few times a night, which is enormous. So I wish someone had told me that sleep can be this complex, because I was out there looking for like a single magic bullet solution of like, what's the one thing I'm doing wrong? What's the one thing I can change? And I wish someone had said that you don't need to fix sleep all at once, and you don't need to control everything. Start with one anchor and get it consistent in a way that's working for your kid, and then try at the next variable, because I was just throwing everything I had at it and doing all sorts of different things all the time, and it was really hard to know what was working. But for us, when we switched and we got that anchor of a consistent wake time with the light in the morning and that consistent sort of letting the naps be short, we didn't touch bedtime and nothing was overhauled overnight, but just stopping that morning from drifting later and later did change things for us. So if you're curious about experimenting with this, I would recommend picking a wake up window, because that some people it might work to have like a minute perfect time. Like we wake up at 7 a.m. But for us, we picked a window, which was if our child wakes before this time, we will resettle them and try and get them back to sleep. So, if our wake up time was 7 till 7:30 a.m. and they woke at 6:30, we would try and get that kid back to sleep until their next wake up time between 7 and 7:30. If they weren't awake at the end of that window, 7:30, we would wake them up. So we would let whatever natural wake up happened in that time be the wake time for the day. And then it was like, if they're not awake by this time, that's when we'll wake them up. We aimed for it most days. There were just some days that I just could not drag myself out of bed. And if my kids stayed asleep past 7:30 and I could rest in bed for a bit longer, I would do that. Unfortunately for me, my child woke so regularly that was never a huge amount of a sleep in, but we gave it a go. We aimed for it most days. We prioritized the light exposure when we could. Obviously, weather can really affect that. And trying not to panic if some days don't go to plan. Again, much easier said than done when you're in that depths of despair. But realizing that this is a big picture change. Sleep is a long-term game, not a short-term one. And any change you can make slowly and consistently over a long period of time is going to serve you well in the long run. And it's okay to miss it on a day-to-day basis. I've been talking for a while about this, so I'm going to wrap up now. But in the next episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about sleep needs. So why that idea of a 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. sleeper can cause a lot of unnecessary guilt and also a lot of unnecessary grief. Because if that is your picture of what children need, then you will feel really guilty if they don't get it, and you'll feel really sad that you're not getting that rest time either. But once you understand how much sleep your child needs in 24 hours, so much of that pressure lifts, and it also makes a really, really big difference for sleep pressure, which I've mentioned a little bit today. So I'll go into heaps more detail next week, but it was another really, really massive contributor for us of getting sleep a little bit more under control. So if this episode brought up for you any sort of grief or frustration or resistance, it makes sense because sleep deprivation is brutal. It is a form of torture, and you are not doing it wrong. You're not broken for finding it hard. You're parenting in a body that needs rest, and you're responsible for helping another tiny body find sleep too. So it's really, really hard stuff. And if you just have a kid that doesn't fit the mold and the regular advice you get doesn't work, I know how hard that is. So I'm hoping that this might be just one ingredient in the things that might help sleep feel more manageable in your house. And I would love to hear from you. So please reach out, and I hope you enjoy the next multiple episodes as I share each of those ingredients that helped us get sleep under control. Thanks for being here. Thanks so much for listening to Not Just Theories. I really appreciate you being here. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the show is to follow, leave us a rating or review, or just share this episode with someone else who you think might find it comforting or useful. I hope to see you back here soon.